Views expressed in the following program are those of the individual authors and participants and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University, the United States Air Force, the Air Command and Staff College, or the Department of Defense.
We are now 1 year into the war in Ukraine, where Putin and the Russians invaded Ukraine, and we are not. We don't know the end result yet. So we are very thankful today to be joined by Dr. Michael Kruzer and Dr. Williamm Dean from the Air War College, and then Dr. Davis from the Department of Political Science, to delve into some of these issues and to find out a little more detail on the invasion in Ukraine.
So Dr. Dean, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And let's kick things off by asking you, how do we end up in the situation in which we are today? How did the war take place? What led to the invasion?
Putin came to power as a war started, the Second Chechen War. He saw himself many ways like Tsar Nicholas II, where he wanted to make Russia great again. He wanted to reestablish the borders that had been lost in 1991. He did it with Georgia, he did it with Chechnya, operations inside Syria. In the Donbass and Crimea, there's political turmoil inside Kiev. The Russians go in a hybrid operation and seize Crimea. He had won all these campaigns. He still was unsatisfied. He wanted to prevent Ukraine from joining the West. And so he thought in a quick, easy, preemptive move, he could conquer good chunks of Ukraine.
Excellent. And Michael, why did the original invasion attempt fail?
Well, to add to what Bill had to say first, I think Thucydides' observation of 2,500 years ago, fear, honor, interest matters. His interests are in the Black Sea, and he had 8 years where he was slowly having trouble resupplying Crimea. So the timeline there is important. Where he failed is he overestimated his power. He underestimated the resolve, the honor of the Ukrainians to resist. He thought he could make a multi-pronged attack, and importantly of these, he thought he could take the capital city of Kiev quickly, and in our terminology, take off the head of the snake. That failed on all counts. It was too complex, had too many moving pieces, and his army, frankly, was not as ready for it as most observers thought they were. And so this has led him to a fallback position, which is the war of attrition, which we've now seen for about a year thus far.
And what has Washington's response been? What is the American role in this war?
I think overall President Biden administration, Tony Blinken, have done a pretty reasonable job. They're having to resist calls on one side of isolationism, of not caring at all what happens in Ukraine, and the other extreme of wanting to send very provocative weapons into the country. We do not want to back Putin into a corner, but we do want to prevent him from taking over the Ukraine, and it would be nice if Ukraine got some of its territory back that it lost in 2014, although that's much more difficult. Putin is a destabilizing influence in Europe, particularly Eastern Europe. He is not mad. He is not irrational. He is a rational actor, but he's a rational actor that has goals that are contrary to the liberal norms of Western Europe and the United States.
So what was Putin's ultimate objective, do you think, in the invasion?
So this was one of the big questions that was difficult to decipher in advance, because When I was looking at it in the run-up, we saw the announcements and we were selectively leaking the information that showed we knew what they were building towards and an invasion was coming. For my looking at the troop numbers, it didn't make much sense because to take all of Ukraine, they didn't have nearly enough troops, I would thought, to take the whole thing. It seemed like the initial and best interest, what he was going for was, again, going for the Crimean Peninsula, reuniting it with the Donbass and having that land bridge extended. And right now he has that, to be certain. The problem he's run into is Putin has extended from the beginning the goals of the war to show that he wants a larger Ukraine and he wants to pull all of Ukraine back into the Russian sphere of interest. He talks about a red, white, and blue Russia between classic, what we call Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, and he would like to see that reunited, as Bill mentioned in the beginning. And a big part of our problem right now is I don't see how he gets there from here, given the facts on the ground today, at least not in the immediate future.
Do you think the Western media has been fair in describing the Ukraine's gains, and why has Ukraine been so successful, but what are the limitations of Ukraine's success?
The key is information operations. The Ukrainians have been brilliant at spinning this. The Russians have been their own worst enemies in engaging in extraordinary human rights abuses in places like Bucha. In many ways, Zelensky has played the Western media pretty well. We don't know, for example, what the casualties are of the Ukrainians. It's really hard for us to make a decent assessment in understanding how much equipment and how much they've done. And Ukraine is presented as almost this ideal little heroic republic when the truth is not as quite as nice as been portrayed on the media. But they certainly look a hell of a lot better than Russia, and our advantage in this is to see Russia bled white.
So my question is to both of you in turn, and that is, we're in Alabama here in the United States. Why should we care about what's happening over in Ukraine, or that it's been a full year of war? What's the big takeaway for us?
Well, I mean, the first and most immediate impact for the state of Alabama, of course, right here in Troy, Alabama, we are producing javelins here in the city that is directly feeding the conflict in Ukraine right now. So there is an immediate economic impact locally. More broadly, though, what I think you're really interested in is the broader argument for the United States. What are the interests of the United States in this conflict? This is a challenging one. I will admit. I will tend to side with the prospect of what does the liberal international order mean? How does it benefit the United States, and what is the stability and what is the principle at stake? The world is watching what is happening, and since the end of the Cold War in 1991, a common theme of the United States and our foreign policy is that we respect the borders and the sovereignty of nations, and we are not going to stand by and let revisionist actors fundamentally alter that map. And if you're looking at this situation from somewhere else in the world, if you're in the Indo-Pacific area, if you are in the Middle East, lots of people would like to see these maps change. And once we open up that Pandora's box, that's a very dangerous situation for the United States.
The United States needs to be a force of stability, and we can maintain that stability through international liberal organizations. The preservation of NATO is crucial. NATO in the previous administration suffered some destabilization, and one of the things, this is an opportunity to strengthen NATO, to strengthen our alliance with the various European nations. I will say the European nations have not helped as much as they should have, and I think initially were rather naive in dealing with this entire situation, but it's a wake-up call to the United States. It also will lead to dramatic changes, particularly in the United States Army. As we speak, the United States Army is rethinking how it fights wars.
I would add to that, too, as questionable as parts of the discussion have been with our European allies, especially if you look, though, to the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, per capita, per GDP spending for them is actually significantly higher than the United States is, because that gets to, this is the frontier of the liberal order, and this is what is at stake.
But I'm thinking of the Germans,
Absolutely.
the Italians, the French, etc.
Understood.
I mean, just to beg the Germans to give 100 tanks and then them digging their heels in is not a hopeful sign.
So there's a push for more weapons to be sent to Ukraine. And what is the fine line that the Biden administration has been walking, and why has it been walking this fine line between sending enough troops to win on the battlefield or enough weapons to win on the battlefield versus escalation of the conflict?
There is some practical problems. If you have multiple types of tanks, you have to come up with multiple types of ammunition and multiple types ways of training. That's the first practical problem. The second is, how far do you extend the war? So Americans have artillery called HIMARS that can fire over 300 kilometers and are accurate to a meter. Do you want to fire 300 kilometers deep into Russia, and would that seen as a provocation by them? Getting fighter planes, everybody's all excited about that, but you can't just throw somebody in a cockpit of an F-16. It takes a while to train them. And then is that escalatory? I think Michael talks a lot about the escalatory ladder in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. So to get back to that point there about the F-16s in particular, to train a U.S. F-16 pilot after their commission takes a minimum of a year and a half to get through the American training pipeline. It's conceivable we could find ways to shorten that in a conflict situation, but this is a weapon system that's very different from the old Soviet era MiGs that they're used to flying. The main question and the main concern we have, for the most part, is over what we talk about as the escalation ladder. You'll recall right after the war began, there was discussion of sending MiG-29s from Poland to Ukraine, and we went back and forth on that. The problem is, with where we were in the war, that would be a significant escalation, and that would likely provoke the Russians to extend provocation even further, potentially extend the war to Moldova, or use more intense weapons and possibly even go up to the tactical nuclear weapons area, which is what we've been most concerned about. So escalation control has been one of our primary concerns. And so instead of jumping from basic support of artillery to weapons, we've been gradually stepping up what we've been providing in a way that each one would just be seen as a small step forward and not a major provocation that could extend the war in ways we don't want it to go.
A real surprise in this war is we thought that air power would be the dominant force, that it would win the campaign for the Russians. They had a large air force. And in the first couple of months of the war, the Russians lost over 200 aircraft. They lost their best and most experienced pilots, particularly their trainers. So they're relying on weaker pilots. Corruption has dramatically weakened the Russian Air Force. And so what's really been key in this is the use of drones and precision artillery has really been key in this, and air defense artillery. You now have Ukrainians that can carry like an SA-7, hide in a barn. His radio controller guys can tell him a Russian plane is coming nearby. He steps out of the barn, fires the SA-7, and brings down the Russian airplane. It's a very inexpensive solution, and the Russians have been very slow to adapt. That's one of the stories of this whole campaign, is the slow adaptation of the Russian military.
I think I'd go further. Yeah, that's the biggest story of this war. And back to your early question about why the Russians haven't been as successful, has been the Ukrainians for the last 8 years have been watching, have been learning, have been aided by American partnerships and training and knowledge. They have been good at adopting the modern system of combined arms warfare and incorporating some of these new, I won't say necessarily lower tech, but at least smaller and more mobile systems, and trusting at the tactical level their field operators to make them work. The Russians, very centralized, a lot of expensive, a lot of money spent on high-end machines, high-end aircraft that look good and make them look scary, but they don't have the practical effect on the battlefield that most analysts were looking at before the war.
Everybody overestimated what the Russians were going to do. I was told by analysts, people in the know, in the first 5 days, well, the Russians are going to take the airfield north of Kiev, they're going to overrun Kiev, they're going to go in and kill Zelensky, because assassination was part of the campaign plan. One of the many things that makes Russia so different from the West. We don't have assassination as part of our campaign plans, but they tied their intelligence services, particularly the GRU, to doing things like that. And how well the Ukrainians did was also a surprise, but of course they're fighting for their existence. This is a defining moment in Ukrainian history. There are now no longer any doubts about who is Ukrainian and what it means to be Ukrainian.
I have a follow-up question again for both of you, but so within the context of the war, we see the rise of China, and with the U.S. having a global presence, how do we maintain our support for Ukraine all the while maintaining the deterrence necessary for Taiwan? So how do we balance both China and Russia with the Ukraine war going on?
Bill, I'll defer to you first on this one.
The first thing, I think we have always overestimated the power of China. Think in China, half of the military has to stay home and keep the peace. COVID showed how fragile, corrupt, and incompetent the Chinese government was. I think that we have to deter them from taking Taiwan, but I'm not sure they're willing to take the step. And the final part, everyone seems to think it's going to be natural for China and Russia to become close friends. China is the ultimate realist nation. Xi is the ultimate realist leader. If he sees Russia weak, well, we'll sell him lots of stuff, but we aren't going to be best friends because I don't want a weak ally.
Yeah, so the lessons learned for a potential China conflict, everyone is looking, and this is the multi-million-dollar question, multi-billion-dollar question, obviously what we're talking about. We've talked for years about what we talk about as a porcupine strategy for Taiwan, which is basically what you're seeing enacted in Ukraine, where you have, if a country is going to take and seize and hold another territory, they have to worry not just about the massive initial movement to take it, but they have to find ways to hold it. So if you think, though, like a porcupine, the first goal of defending Taiwan would be a potential 1,000 cuts instead of a massive strike at the beginning to defend, and then once China would be on the island, what the resistance would look like. The first thing to wonder about is the question of nationalism on Taiwan, because as Bill has noted, this has been a defining moment for Ukraine. The minute China does try to attack Taiwan, would that be the moment that this question about Taiwanese nationalism is resolved? That's the first question. It's unknown, because right now that question is a big divide in Taiwan. As far as what our strategy is, that's also problematic. So the Air Force and the Army are learning different lessons right now and having different answers. The Air Force is most concerned with the anti-access and aerial denial threat posed by China, and so looking at long-range missile systems and air defense, and so how can we build new sixth-generation systems and longer-range missiles to neutralize that first so that they can provide cover. Whereas the Army's preferred perspective would be to say, look, Ukraine is proving that against a threat like Russia, which is what a lot of them think China would be like, again, a strong centralized dictatorship, hasn't fought a war since 1979, they're going to have problems. So actually, instead of going for deep targets inside of China right away, let's rely on smaller drones, have the Navy have similar teams in the water, and just have a denial strategy and keep them off the coast of Taiwan through smaller actions like this, and not go and keep, again, escalation down. Do not escalate to the major air war to begin with.
China has a long history of being persecuted by the West. You had the century of humiliation, the collapse of the Qing dynasty. You have the French fleet in the 1880s going up to Foochow and sinking the entire Chinese fleet. You had French foreign legionnaires fighting on Taiwan in the Sino-French War. You had Japanese occupation, first in the Sino-Japanese War, and then World War II, genocide inside China. So any idea that we launch attacks on Beijing or Shanghai or conduct a bombing campaign is absolute madness. That is an invitation to nuclear war. The Chinese will not turn the other cheek on this. They are extraordinarily sensitive to aggression. What we should learn from the Russian thing with China is to take a moderate approach, to not take this aggressive approach, and in some ways tone down our rhetoric.
And in a In a lot of ways, there's been some evidence, although it's obviously disputed, that the Chinese are looking at the Ukrainian situation and learning some lessons themselves. On the other end, some people worry, are we depleting the Army's ability to fight by sending artillery? It's entirely possible. At the same time, though, this again gets to the question of what is the nature of this war in the Pacific, or the character of this war in the Pacific going to look like. Heavy air and heavy naval focus, so initially, maybe not necessarily, and maybe we have a time to ramp up the industrial production of those armed materials. I think right now we do have a good balance that can be managed, but part of the question is, where does this war go over the coming years, and what is the U.S. and Chinese lessons from it?
This war is going to force us to recapitalize our military force. The Paladin 155 system, for example, most of those are 35 years old. We have a lot of old airplanes, a lot of old artillery. We are coming up with new organizations, but we have got to replace a lot of equipment. I mean, it's down to that. Maybe the good thing that comes out of this war is it makes us look seriously at recapitalizing our military forces. But they're old forces now, and we're also facing severe recruitment problems. Not only are the Russians having recruitment problems, and ours aren't that severe, but we ourselves cannot make our recruitment goals with old equipment.
Good. I wanted to ask both of you, what do you think victory looks like? What's the theory of victory?
Yes. So that's a great question, because the theory of victory is a central concept that we discuss a lot in our courses, and that the military in general is working hard about. Because right now we have, in the U.S. military, we have very strong operational theories of victories, which is to say we know how to win battles, we know how to win campaigns, we know how militarily to defeat adversaries. That is fundamentally different, though, from winning wars, which is more the domain of politics. And frankly, right now, I don't think at this point either side has a coherent theory of victory. They have some clear desired end state objectives, where we've said Putin would like to seize full control of Ukraine and bring it back into the Russian sphere of influence. President Zelensky has stated that he would like to see it returned to the 1991 borders. So Thomas Schelling famously talked about the difference between brute force and coercive strategies. And the main difference is coercion is fundamentally about negotiation and the recognition that there is at least some common ground between the two sides, and so the force and threat of force can bring about a negotiation. The problem right now is because of the expectations set by the Russians at the beginning and what Zelensky would like to accomplish, but his limited means of accomplishing it, their two desires are so far apart that we are in a pure brute force world right now. And so I think the unfortunate truth is, for at least the near-term foreseeable future, more costs are going to have to be paid by both sides to convince them that what they have set out is unrealistic, and they're going to need to slowly change the messaging to make it so that an ultimate compromise is possible.
My fear is a repeat of a World War I scenario. When the German army surrendered in November 1918, it was still in the field, it was still intact. The British blockade had led to starvation inside Germany. 500,000 people starved. When German soldiers were surrendering to people like Sergeant York, they said, "Hoch Republik, nicht Kaiser." Up with the Republic, no Kaiser. It led to political radicalization. It led to a communist revolution inside Germany, and of course that helped set the stage for Herr Hitler and all that. And what I'm concerned, a lot of Americans look to decapitation. Well, we brought down Saddam Hussein or Gaddafi or whatever, and we should have brought down Assad.
And they all worked so well for us each time we did that.
And each time it turned into a bloody disaster. And I am not enthusiastic about the idea of Putin being overthrown, because then you could have civil war. You could have civil war with warlords, and warlords that have nuclear weapons. We do not want a repeat of the Russian Civil War with much greater advanced technology.
Yeah, and this gets back to your point there, if we think back to the earlier conversation we had about supplying F-16s, because there's a number of people in the United States who are either on the perspective of let's give them the tools they need to win, which they clearly define again as an operational theory of victory, how to defeat the Russian military on the battlefield, or this isn't our problem, let's pull back altogether. So the problem with the former who want to give things like F-16, the question is, okay, that will provide a theory of operational success. In theory, let's say we don't have to worry about training them. Let's say they magically have the ability to fly these aircraft and to drop precision bombs on target. And let's say after all that happens and you defeat the Russian Air Force and are able to bomb the enemy until you've destroyed the Russian army, then what? Putin is not simply going to slink back, concede defeat, and walk away from Ukraine. It's an invitation to some next step, and we have to be prepared for that. And if somehow he is forced to concede, then we are worried about that situation where he has now lost so much clout that he is vulnerable at home.
The goal is to restore stability, to restore liberal norms in Europe, to let Putin save face, and to find an off-ramp. And weapons, F-16s or whatever, are not an end in themselves. They are a means to an end. This ultimately will be decided by diplomacy. I don't think it'll be decided on the battlefield. I think attrition warfare, and again, World War I, the great example of that, is not what we want to happen. What happened in Germany in 1918 led to World War II. It led to a disaster. So we have to let our opponents, and Putin is a bad guy, but we have to let him save face and find an off-ramp for both battling nations.
Good. I do have a question for both of you. Looking at the conflict so far, what are the main lessons? What have we learned?
I think what we most need to take away, again, at the operational level, is the value of combined arms warfare, and with that, the need for a trust in a strong professional military and what goes with that. We in the United States are at the forefront of that. Technology has been vital. Technology is helping the Ukrainians dramatically, but more importantly than the technology and the manpower is the organizations they are putting in the field that is helping them to outmaneuver, outflank, and outlearn, most importantly, what is going on in the battlefield. So as we look to places like the Indo-Pacific, like the Middle East and elsewhere, this is a pattern that we see repeated over and over again, and it's easy to focus on the technology and the shiny objects that are new, and we keep hearing time again, the next war is going to be fought with new technology that we have to master and we have to get ahead. Every war in history has been fought with new and unseen technology. It's about the organizational capacity to adopt to it and to implement it in real time.
One of the, specifically to add to and build on Michael's point, we have to rethink about how to fight in divisions and corps. The establishment of 5 Army Corps in Eastern Europe is a start. We have to move away from the brigade combat team. Just as the Russians have learned their battalion combat teams don't work, we have to move to be able to fight conventional war. But we also have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We still have to maintain some capability to fight irregular warfare while at the same time shifting our training to conventional war. We have to recapitalize our military, and we have to have a coherent strategy. It's no good to have a good Army or Air Force or Navy and not have it tied to a strategy. New technological systems are not a strategy, and one of the central problems we've fallen into is we, instead of going threat-based strategies, we've gone to a capabilities-based strategy, and that has led us into the fog.
Do you guys have any final thoughts as we wrap up the program?
Bill, I'll defer to you.
This is a very dangerous situation. It impacts everyone in the state of Alabama and the United States. I have a son that's a lieutenant colonel in the Army, and I do not want him going to Eastern Europe. A larger scale war there would be devastating for not only the European economy, but for American economy. So I think we need to work hard for peace right now and not get too excited about the tools of war.
Yeah. Clausewitz reminds us that war is the extension of politics with other means, and others will also say that politics is the extension of war with other means. I think instead of talking about victory and winning, we need to focus on that broader, what is the politics and what looks after this.
Excellent, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a great pleasure.